Hi, Ken.
Hi, Dylan. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you. I was talking to your colleague, Brian Leiter, about our friend Nietzsche, and I wanted to do a little bit maybe of a continuation, even though, that podcast isn't out yet. You haven't heard what we talked about, but I'd like to do a little bit of a continuation of that conversation.
Sure.
We had discussed how morality, how our current Judeo-Christian morality came to be, valuing things like, humility instead of pride, chastity or, poverty, things like that. Kind of, what we look at as morality is generosity, pity, sympathy, and how those came to be according to Nietzsche's story. And Nietzsche's story is that there was these Jewish slaves and their Roman masters, and the Jewish slaves couldn't get actual revenge against these horrible, brutal Roman masters. And so they did the next best thing, which is to try to make the Roman masters feel inferior, or maybe more accurately, try to make themselves feel superior, righteous. Oh, you think strength is great? Actually, you're a horrible person. You're cruel. You're insensitive. We are actually the good people. And this is kind of how Judeo-Christian morality came to be and has come to us now. Now, you have stated somewhere that you don't think that Nietzsche meant this as a historical account. Tell me about that. And if he didn't mean it as a historical account of how our morality came to be, what was he doing? What was the purpose of it?
So, Nietzsche says, he who reads me well reads me first and foremost as a psychologist. And I really think he's playing with his audience's psychology. He's actually doing a kind of therapy, right? Remember, his key audience, his main audience, are the Germans of his time. And so he screws with them in a certain way by telling them, you really are the Jews. Because he says Christianity, he says it in the Antichrist, the Christian is only the Jew thrice small, thrice being a kind of a joke on the Trinity. So, it's really, really difficult for the Germans of the 19th century what their identity is. Remember, in the north, there are the Protestants. In the south, there are the Catholics. Someone from Hamburg could barely understand the German of someone from Munich, from southern Germany. The one thing the Germans knew is we're not Jews. So Nietzsche screws with his audience by telling themselves, you are the Jews, because the Jews gave you the Christianity, be it Protestantism or Catholicism, that you think is central to your identity. So he's trying to destabilize his audience's identity. It's a nasty game, but that's really what he's really doing. So that's why he tells this kind of just so story. And when you look at the details of the stories, you can see he must have been aware of it. First of all, consider the idea of Jewish slaves. Well, in the time of the Roman Empire, the Jews in Palestine, Jerusalem, whatever you want to call it, they weren't slaves at all. They weren't, some of them were citizens of the Roman empires. They weren't Romans, but they weren't actually in slavery, right? I mean, other times, rather than talking about slaves, he talks to them about it as slavish people or a people of resentment. But I really think what he's doing with this story about the Jews is trying to get his German audience, as he says in the preface of Genealogy of Morals. At the end of it, they say, what did we just hear now? Or even more, who are we? He's trying to problematize their identity by getting them to see that their Christianity, which they venerate, is really just kind of a tool of the Jews. And he tells this kind of conspiracy theory that the Jews invented Christianity just so the idiot Romans would get the bait. Now, he doesn't really believe that the Jews invented Christianity for that reason. And also, if you go to his other book that talks a lot about this, I've been referring obliquely to the Genealogy of Morals. If you go to the Antichrist, in the Antichrist, he actually says the original invention of these new values, Judeo-Christian values, came at the time of the Babylonian exile. And there he's reading a historian called Wellhausen, where it's claimed originally the Jews, before the exile, were a warrior people with noble values. Their god was just the totem they carried into battle who guaranteed them victory. But when that god got defeated, because the Babylonians completely obliterated them, and the king and the priest were taken into exile in Babylon, it's then the priests reinvented Judaism and said, oh no, our God isn't a God who guarantees us victory. Our God is a God who punishes us for our hubris, who uses people like the Babylonians against us because we were overly proud, because we were vain or whatever. So he tells different stories at different places. But this idea that there was just that he's trying to get an accurate history, I think one has to be really suspicious of that. He's involved in a very interesting rhetorical game to undermine the identity of his German audience.
To be clear, Ken, he's appealing to he's appealing to the reputation of Jews among Germans. So he's trying to get an emotional reaction out of them, right?
It's a nasty game. Look, I just want to say on the side, if you ask me, is Nietzsche an anti-Semite? In our sense of the notion of anti-Semite, was he prejudiced against Jews? Yeah, just about him and just about everyone else in Germany in those days. But he wasn't an anti-Semite of the 19th century stripe, because in the 19th century, to be an anti-Semite, it was a political nationalist movement. And he totally repudiated those anti-Semites. You know, his sister married one called Forster, who he absolutely hated. He didn't like nationalism, and he didn't like the parochialism of those anti-Semites, but nevertheless, he uses his audience's sensibilities about Jews to undermine them in a certain way.
Yeah, and I think one of the things he said about Jesus, you know, he was too Jewish or something like that. So yeah.
Well, what he says about, he says a beautiful thing about Jesus in the Antichrist. He says there was only one true Christian, and he died on the cross. Because what he wants to say is, he actually thinks Jesus has very little to do with Christianity, because he says he got this idea from Tolstoy's My Religion. He thinks what Christ was preaching was this earth could be heaven on earth if we could get over our resentment and love each other. In the Antichrist, he puts his finger on Paul as the brains of the outfit. He said Paul invented the Judeo-Christian outlook that we know. That is, it's a repudiation of this world, saying this world is just a horrible place and the real world is the world to come. And so he said Paul had rancor towards this world, because in that way you mentioned before about slaves, he felt frustrated within it. So he kind of tries to make this world look like not the real world, not important. What's important is the world to come. And it's really Paul that Nietzsche really repudiates, because Paul is kind of, he calls him an apostle of hate, a man full of rancor and hatred towards this, the one and only world.
You know, and to be fair, you know, you could probably make the case that Nietzsche not only didn't like Jews, he probably, you know, he didn't like anybody, really. You could point to just about any group, including Germans, and say, well, you know, he didn't like them either.
Well, he was very careful, because he realized, I don't want to be associated with these horrible, nationalist, foolish anti-Semites. So even in the Genealogy of Morals and other places, he says it's very clear who was first rate, meaning the Jews, and who was fifth rate, and he says the Germans. So he made all these little asides to get his readers to realize, if they read closely, that he doesn't mean to be with those crass political anti-Semites. As I say, he's real, you know, I'm just writing a paper called Who Are Nietzsche's Christians? And I actually don't think he cared that much about the Christians. What he really cares about is the realization of Christian ideals. And funnily enough, he knew full well the historical Christians. Think about the popes in Rome, you know, who were, you know, princes, who had power, who had armies. They weren't exactly egalitarian democrats. But he says Christian preaches this idea that every human is intrinsically valuable, of infinite valuable, because it's a child of God. And those values, while they were preached for centuries, only really get implemented now in the 19th century, when we're moving towards socialism, democracy, egalitarianism, when we're moving towards what he calls rule of the herd. I mean, in historical Catholicisms, the herd, the peasants, the ordinary people didn't rule, the popes ruled. It was really hierarchical. Now, Nietzsche says he likes noble cultures. Well, the Roman Catholic Church had a noble culture, in a sense. It had a hierarchy. So the funny thing is, while he seems he's got incredible rancor against the Christians, what he's really telling us is Christian ideals were preached for centuries, but only preached, not practiced. They're being practiced today, and they are leading to a world of mediocrity.
Well, most
Sorry.
people would have a problem, would say, well, practice what you preach. It sounds like Nietzsche is saying, no, in this case, it was great when you preached it. The problem was when you practiced it.
I'm not saying it was great that it was preached it, because, when you preach something a bit by bit, it might seep in and actually become realized. But yes, what people say, what opinions they have, even what they believe aren't so important. What's really important for Nietzsche are your practices. And, they say that judge a person by their deeds, not by what they say. Well, Nietzsche's a bit like that. And he's saying, look, the Christians preached Christianity. They didn't do Christianity. The funny thing is, we moderns, many of us who are atheists, we don't preach Christianity. At least we don't believe in the father figure in the sky and immortal souls. But we're practicing Christian values for the first time in history, with the democratic egalitarian movements of the 19th century. That is the practical realization of Christianity. And that's what he objects to.
Okay, well, if he objects to this, part of me thinks, well, what's the problem, considering that this Judeo-Christian this ethic that he thinks hinders great people, right? The Christian morality for the herd is fine, right? Herd morality for the herd, as he says. But there's great people, Nietzsche included, he believes, Beethoven, Goethe, Napoleon. And he thinks that Christian morality is could hinder their greatness. Now, the problem is all of these people are products of Judeo-Christian morality. And I think you say that there's no good evidence that Judeo-Christian morality actually hinders these higher men from being higher or from being great.
Because what Nietzsche really values are both higher individuals, people with extreme talents, genius, artistic talents, whatever, and also high culture. I think he values both, and they have a symbiotic relationship, because high culture can help produce these great individuals, and these individuals help produce high culture. But both these great individuals and high culture are ends in themselves for Nietzsche. And your point is exactly right. All the people he venerates, Goethe is always on his list. Beethoven is always on his list. Wagner was on the list and off the list. Nietzsche is always on his own list. You can see them as all products of Judeo-Christian culture. And actually Nietzsche himself says it, that in fact, in the end, I have to say yes to Christianity, because Christianity in the end led to me, this sheer megalomaniacy of his. Without Christianity, you wouldn't have a Nietzsche. Nietzsche's whole identity is in some sense formed in a reaction against Judeo-Christianity, but that means he couldn't have been who he is without it. So he knows this point. I think what he's thinking is, and here is part of a whole lot of 19th century thinkers. You can think of de Tocqueville, who talks about the tyranny of the masses, Taine, John Stuart Mill, his mentor Burckhardt. They all thought that what's coming is this mass democracy, where it's not that the ideas of the herd rule in the herd, which he endorsed it, the ideas of the herd are meant to rule everyone. And so that basically everyone has to become, the pressure becomes in an egalitarian democratic society that everyone becomes a member of the herd. It becomes hegemonic. And so that is his objection. Now, we in hindsight, we can look back and say, you were wrong. I think this is Richard Rorty's response to Nietzsche. Rorty would say, look, I too can see the value of great individuals, but why not liberal democratic forms of society as a means of getting individuals the opportunity to self-create? Other people, might agree with Nietzsche and say, oh no, I think the last century is full of mediocrities. But Nietzsche's worry was his triumph of egalitarian values is going to suck everyone into the herd. That the herd wouldn't have its place. There's always been herds, but the herd wouldn't have its place. It would become the norm for everyone, and that would militate against great individuals and high culture. I think he may be wrong about great individuals. I think the 19th and 20th century are full of great individuals. He might be right about it militates against high culture. The culture of football becomes dominant. Yeah.
When I originally thought about Nietzsche's view about higher men, I thought, it's basically people who change culture. So, maybe the Beatles, could be, Nirvana. It's great creative minds who have made a large impact. But the more and more I think about it and hear people talk about Nietzsche, it sounds like these great people, there's much less of them than I had thought.
He's very much a proponent and fan of elite culture. So as I say, it's the Goethe and the Beethovens and the Wagners. Whether the Beatles would have made the list, who knows? And he has this metaphor of the peaks. There are the peaks, meaning these great individuals, and then there's the rest of us in the valleys. And you'll notice you can't have peaks without valleys. And he thinks these peaks are in a kind of funny kind of conversation, because he's in a conversation with Goethe, but Goethe can't really hear him, but he can hear Goethe and he can react to Goethe. And then there are other people who are very influenced by Nietzsche, geniuses like Thomas Mann or the poet Rilke or Hermann Hesse, and they're in conversation with Nietzsche. Nietzsche can't hear them, because he's dead, but they heard him. And that's what he cares about, the kind of the republic of genius, so to speak. But you're right, they're few and far between. For instance, ordinary philosophy professors, he says, oh, they're all very useful, but they're not ends in themselves. We scholars, he didn't think much of, scholars, they're okay, and they can help keep the ideas of a Nietzsche and a Goethe alive, but they aren't the real engines that form these ideas.
Well, speaking of philosophy professors, they like this thing called reason. And, Socrates, made reason, I guess, famous, the guiding, towards the truth and asking these questions that philosophers are still asking and trying to answer today using reason. The reason I brought up Nietzsche's story of morality and that it wasn't necessarily meant as a historical account was to bring up, I wanted you to talk about how Nietzsche thinks people are convinced. If it's not through reason, which I think is what you're going to maybe say, what is it that he thinks gets people to change their minds about things? And then also, if you can, what is then the role of reason or the use of reason for Nietzsche?
You're asking a lot there, so I'll divide it into two parts. I'll talk about how he intends to convince people. He is of a mind, as a lot of modern psychologists are, that our reasons are post hoc rationalizations, that we really come to various views for various emotive reasons or because we've been schooled that way, and then afterwards we come up with justifications, and we pretend those justifications are what originally caused us to subscribe to the views. But he thinks, no, you subscribe to the views for a whole set of different grounds, not your reasons. Okay, so what he tries to do is, he thinks if he can change what I would call the affective valence of an idea, that is the emotions you associate it with it, that will move you off the idea more than giving reasons. You see, remember going back to what I said about the Judeo-Christian religion and the way he argues against it, argues in inverted commas, he tries to revolt his German audience because he knows they're kind of squeamish about Jews and they find the Jews strange and uncanny. And he tries to say, well, these Christian ideas, they're really Jewish ideas. And, like in section 14 of the genealogy of morals, he talks about these underground nook dwellers who are plotting and fabricating these Christian ideals. So he makes them look as nasty little manipulative plotters. So he tries to arouse his audience's effects, because he thinks, if I can get you to emotionally have a negative kind of connection with Christianity, that will move you off it more than any other arguments. So he plays with his audience's emotion because he believes it's emotional resonances that really move people. And then after they've moved, they drum up reasons to explain their move. Now, about reason in philosophy, look, there's so many places. This is the second part of the answer. There are so many places where Nietzsche seems to be extolling the instincts. What is instinct is good. What is done by reason is almost counterproductive. He gives a negative gloss. But you've got to think about the way Nietzsche thinks. He's a very rhetorical thinker, and often he champions A over B, not because he wants A to win and B to be killed. It's because B is already the winner. and he needs to balance the two. Like, for instance, in this very first book of his, The Birth of Tragedy, he talks about the Apollonian. And the Apollonian is connected to form, giving, and reason. And the Dionysian, which is kind of wild and inebriated and sexual and instinctive, etc. And when you first read it, you think, man, this guy's all for the Dionysian. But that's not the way. When you read it carefully, you realize, oh, he's championing the Dionysian, not because he wants to obliterate the reason and the Socratic and the Apollonian, all of which he identifies. It's because those guys have already won. We in the modern world have become monsters of reason. We say everything has to be subjected to reason, that reason is the only grounds for doing and believing anything. And he wants to say, no, I want there to be reason, but we also have to allow for the instinctual. We've got what he calls he talks about this with Socrates in Twilight of the Idol, that it's become a pathological demand that we obliterate our instincts and our drives and our natural bodily inclinations, and we just become monsters of reason. And that for Nietzsche is a pathology. But it doesn't mean we should go the opposite way. It means we should get a balance between the two. But it often sounds, because he's championing B over A, it sounds like he wants nothing but B. That's not the view. The view is, I want a balance between B and A, but A doesn't need a champion. It's already won.
Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda, had a lot of influence on culture. So he, for example, was largely responsible for getting women to smoke, for it to be acceptable and cool for women to start smoking, advertising. And he was hired by meat companies to get people to eat bacon. And so the American diet, bacon and eggs, that was largely Edward Bernays. Now, Edward Bernays was the nephew of Sigmund Freud, who was obviously highly influenced by Nietzsche. And Freud's advice to Bernays was, you've got to get into their subconscious minds. So the idea is, like in advertising, instead of just like laying out the features of a product, which nobody ever does in a commercial, right? You have to somehow make the commercial in a way that it really gets in there emotionally or subconsciously.
Freud reads Nietzsche and then covers up his reading of Nietzsche. Now, there's a wonderful phrase by my ex-colleague, Harold Bloom, from my Yale days, the anxiety of influence. And Freud had a lot of anxiety of influence from Nietzsche, and he clearly borrowed from it and tried to cover it up. And there's a stupid literature about this, about, how Freud stole from Nietzsche. But it's just a dumb game about how one genius influences another. Yeah, Freud cared about his success and wanted to cover up his Nietzschean tracks. So what? Freud is a genius in his own right. But yes, Freud and Nietzsche, but also before them, Schopenhauer, think consciousness is just the tip of the iceberg, and what's below the waterline, the subconscious, is the real mover. And then we, as I say, we rationalize afterwards. So I guess Freud was advising Bernays that, yeah, don't think of the reasons and giving explicit grounds. That's not really going to move people. What really moves them is something to do with what he'd call the id, something below the level of consciousness. And, one thing to be said about all this is, very contrary to Freud and Nietzsche and Schopenhauer is Kant, where Kant thought what is really valuable is our faculty of reason, and one should appeal to that, right? And there's, when you go down the Nietzsche, Freud, Schopenhauer route, there are huge dangers involved for the reasons you're mentioning. Clever propagandists can think of just manipulating people. And, Nietzsche I think Nietzsche was a manipulative person in the way he wrote, with his rhetoric about the Jews and Christians, etc. But he was manipulating him to ends that he really thought was worthwhile. He wasn't trying to sell cigarettes. And propagandists have done a lot worse than that. But generally, I find this is a real problem that, Nietzsche knew he could be misread and misused, and he just didn't care about it. He only cared to talk to the other geniuses, and what ordinary people made of him, he just didn't care. But horrible things can be done in his name or in development of him. Whereas Kant, for instance, had this much more egalitarian, I really think Christian idea, as Nietzsche would say, that every human is deserving of respect. Of course, Nietzsche doesn't respect every human. He thinks most of them are just members of the herd. But, that's a very dangerous way to think. And Kant's way to think, that every human is valuable because they've got this faculty of reason, it's very salutary. And, if followed, has nice consequences as opposed to the possibly nasty consequences of Nietzsche's kind of elitism.
Why does Nietzsche care so much about great people? I mean, most people would say like, oh, geniuses, talented people. Yeah, I mean, they're cool. But Nietzsche, I mean, it seems he seems to be obsessed with
Yeah,
great people and everybody else, go screw yourself.
more or less. Yeah, and that's why Nietzsche's a bit cagey about his own values. Because if he came straight off and said, well, what I value is, the great individuals and high culture, a lot of his readers might think, especially today, my mind, I'd think, yeah, that's what you value, but why should that move us, right? So there is a story to be told, and that is part of the story is Nietzsche thinks a lot of the people who have more egalitarian values and care about their fellow man, they're very, very obsessed with the problem of suffering, right? They're thinking about how can we make a world that alleviates suffering. They're full of Christian compassion, even if they're no longer believing Christians. But he says the problem with seeing suffering as a fundamental problem is that if you're honest about that, as Schopenhauer was, you have to admit that the world is full of suffering, and this kind of crass optimism that thinks by machinery and modern science we can overcoming suffering is just intrinsically wrong. Suffering is an intrinsic part of existence. And if we think the problem of suffering is fundamental, we're inevitably going to be driven to where Schopenhauer was driven, to the conclusion that the world is a bad place. So Nietzsche is trying to figure out how could we see the world to see it as something worthy of affirmation? And one thing he says is if we take our eyes off the problem of suffering and not be obsessed with it, because he thinks that leads to the pessimistic conclusion that the world ought not to be, we could see other vectors of value. And one vector of value are beauty, creativity, artistry. So that gives, if we see those things, we can say, yeah, look, I'm not saying suffering is a great thing, but we don't have to be dead set focused on nothing but the suffering. We can say, yes, the world is full of suffering, but it's also full of great beauty and creativity, and that makes it a worthy object of affirmation. So that's, I mean, I just think he values great people and hopes to be one of them as just an endpoint. But I think he can tell a story. If you don't see something like that, if you really are obsessed with the problem of suffering, you'll end up with a totally pessimistic, life-denying conclusion, if you're honest.
And the life-denying conclusion he thinks is that's his problem with Buddhism. Is that correct?
Well, Buddhism, like Christianity, like Schopenhauerian philosophy, he thinks and they all end in nihilism, because the Buddhism is obsessed with the problem of suffering too. And it says, because the world is full of suffering, we need to kind of escape the world. We need to become selfless, etc. Well, Buddhism is very complicated on whether we ever have a self, etc. But it wants to get out of this world. See, he says, if you're honest about the problem of suffering, you realize suffering is irredeemably part of it, and you end up having rancor to this world, wanting to escape it. The Buddhists want to escape it to nirvana or wherever. The Christians want to escape it, to get to heaven, etc. He said, and Schopenhauer doesn't believe there's an alternative place. So he says, I wish the whole place had never existed and it never should have existed. So he thinks these people who are obsessed with suffering will end up being ultimately what he calls pessimistic and nihilistic. They can avoid it for a while by pretending, like Socrates does, or the Enlightenment thinkers, that we could improve things using science and knowledge. But in the end, you realize it's structural. Suffering is an inevitable part of existence.
Nietzsche famously believed that philosophy is confession. You can tell, a lot about somebody by what their philosophy is, or you could tell a lot about their philosophy by who they are. I'm going to take a psychoanalytic stab here about Nietzsche. So Nietzsche lived a somewhat pathetic life, a lot of it having to do with health. But, had a difficult time in the romantic part of his life, couldn't really get women, had to stoop so low to publish his own books. He was basically a total nobody. People didn't really read him in the sane part of his life. Well, somebody could think, well, no wonder you think that you're one of the few great men in all of human history, and everybody else who has rejected you and not paid any attention to you, oh, they're all the herd. I don't even want to hear from them.
Yeah, Nietzsche was unsuccessful, and as you say, he had to pay for his last 6 books to be published. And he has this bravura performance, especially in this over-the-top book of his, the last thing he wrote called Ecce Homo, which is what Pontius Pilate said to Christ, but he's talking about himself, this megalomaniac book. He has this bravura performance where he says, oh, I know I'm dynamite, I know I'm going to change the future, etc. He didn't know it at the time. He was hoping. The funny thing is, he turned out to be right. But when you see his letters he wrote, he wanted to be known and he wanted to be famous, and it's kind of pathetic in a way. But look at it from a Nietzschean point of view. And it's not exactly only Nietzsche, Aristotle. For Nietzsche and Aristotle, having a good life is not kind of how you feel in the pit of your stomach. It's not about contentment. It's not about something phenomenological. Having a good life is having an imprint on the world, having effectiveness, effective agency, if you want to put it that way. And so, yeah, Nietzsche himself was sick. He had migraines. He was lonely. He was pathetic. I don't think he was emotionally a happy guy. But that's not what a good life is for Nietzsche. Nietzsche just doesn't care about your phenomenology as much as Aristotle doesn't seem to care much. He had a good life because he, in the end, was effective. So for Aristotle, you can live a life that you think is good, and then supposing you're some kind of general and you're conquering and you conquer this and conquer that, and then after you die, it's all wiped out. And Aristotle says, well, then your life can be seen as a failure. The future actually affects the meaning and trajectory of your life. Well, yet Nietzsche during his lifetime hoped that he'd be effective, but didn't see much effect. But in the end, he was. So by his own criteria, he had a wonderful life.
One of Bertrand Russell's major criticisms in his chapter on Nietzsche, where he basically just totally dismisses Nietzsche as a serious thinker. One of his major criticisms is basically we can't even evaluate what his ideas were because he's constantly contradicting himself.
Yeah, I mean, he's not the only philosopher to do that. Hume got himself into some contradictions about the eye, for instance. But yes, but the way to think about this is philosophers normally want to pronounce universally and eternally. Like, is truth good? Yes. Truth is good for everyone at all times. Whereas Nietzsche will say, well, is truth good for this person at this time? I mean, taking him not so much about what is literally true, but what he calls the will to truth. He says, what does the will to truth mean? Oh, for some people, for certain scholars who, fetishize the truth, it represents a kind of passivity. They want to stand back from the world and just be merely passive observers. And here he's kind of, with a reference to Schopenhauer, he said, I just want to be a clear mirror reflector of the world. He says the will to truth in some people, in some scholars, is just an excuse for passivity. But in people like Goethe and myself, our will to truth is part of our positive engagement with the world. We're looking for new values to engage with the world. So, see, most philosophers will say will to truth, yes, everyone should strive for the truth and we should sacrifice everything to the truth. Whereas Nietzsche is what I call a local thinker. He'll say, what does the will to truth mean for this person at this time? So that is why there appears to be all these contradictions, because to unravel the contradictions, you have to see who his targets are. There are so many times when he seems to venerate truth, but that's because he thinks, oh, in my case, in this case, in that case, here the will to truth is something healthy. But in that case, in that other case, the will to truth is a pathology. So that is why most philosophers will either say yes to truth or no to truth or whatever. And they'll want these eternal solutions, a one size fits all. Whereas Nietzsche is a much more subtle thinker than that. That's what appears as the notion of contradictions. To unravel the contradiction, you have to see in this text, at this point, he has this kind of person as a target. In this kind of text, in a different point, has a different target. He actually says in the Gay Science, he says, what is poison for some can be healthy for others. Whereas most philosophers act as if one thing is good for everyone. I mean, think about Mill. What is good? Good is always whatever is furthers the greatest happiness of the greatest number. And it's universal. Nietzsche is not a universal thinker like that. He's much more subtle and nuanced. But that creates appearance of contradiction. You have to do the scholarly work of figuring out who is he addressing here? what pathology is he into here? You know, think about a doctor who prescribed the same medicine whoever walked in, whether they had cancer or a headache. That's not a good doctor. Well, Nietzsche is a kind of a therapist, and he has many different kinds of patients in his mind, and he has different therapies. You wouldn't say a doctor who said, he gave that guy aspirin for a headache, but he's giving a totally different drug for the guy who has cancer. The guy's bloody inconsistent. We wouldn't think like that. Well, think like Nietzsche as a doctor. There isn't really inconsistency. It's a superficial inconsistency.
Okay. I've often suspected that many people in ethics who, for the most part, they believe in objective morality, and they are not deists. They don't believe in God. So they believe in, so they kept the objective morality. I've often suspected that that is a dogma that is left over from religion. So we're going to get rid of the religion, but we're still going to believe that murder is wrong objectively. And, you know, I think Nietzsche made it more clear for me. When I started reading him, I thought, so we've got this cold, dark universe that comes to be without a God. And somehow mixed in that material are values. Like the universe gives a crap about whether you murder somebody or whether you eat a cow. What do you think?
Yeah, this is a very, very tricky question. And you know, one of the wonderful points Nietzsche made, and maybe Brian covered it in the previous interview, is that Nietzsche thinks the core of Christianity is not its metaphysics. It's not belief in that benevolent father figure in the sky. It's not an immortal soul. The core of Christianity is its evaluative structure. And its two fundamental values are the overriding value of compassion, you know, love thy neighbor as you love yourself, and the overriding value of truth. Everything is to be sacrificed to the truth. And Nietzsche says, look, a real interrogation of Christianity comes not just when we get rid of the ontology of Christianity, the Father in the sky, it's when we start questioning the values. And the thing that amazes him is there's so many people who have given up the ontology, the belief in the Father figure and the soul, but they keep the values, right? But then the question is, what are the status of values? Of not just values of those Christian values, of any values. Brian Leiter has argued, you know, fairly in a very stringent, strong way that Nietzsche is not a realist about values. Another scholar, Andrew Huddleston, has tried to fight back about that. There is plenty of text where Nietzsche sees to say all values are merely projected onto the world, right? But hey, a film is projected. It doesn't mean it's not in some sense real. There's a worry about, my feeling on this is, I see Brian's point. There's a lot of text that we read today as if Nietzsche is some kind of anti-realist about values. I don't think Nietzsche was that well thought out about it, frankly. I often think he takes a line to say all values are just Menschenwerk, fabrication, but he's mainly interested in using that as another rhetorical tool to move us off values that he thinks are bad values. So my real feeling is he's not all that well thought out about this kind of more modern question about the objectivity of values. But I see there are plenty of texts that can be read as if to say he thinks values aren't part of the fabric of nature. Sure, there are plenty of texts that go that way. I don't think that was a key issue for him. I don't think he cares that much whether they're real or not. I think he cares about whether they're healthy for us or unhealthy for us.
So a pragmatist in that sense.
In a certain sense, yes. And just whether values really are true or really are objective, there's texts that seem to make him into an anti-realist, but I don't think he was really concentrating on that issue. He was concentrating, as he said, on the value of our values, whether these values are good for us.
You talked about, this might be a tricky question because you might have to separate the herd from a great person, but you talked about the like intrinsic worth of truth. And it's not, you know, truth doesn't get this higher place that, you know, that philosophers always worship. In Nietzsche's picture, there's more to it than that. It's more complex, more nuanced. What if somebody wanted to spend their life studying, you know, the origins of the planet, or, you know, maybe free will, something that we couldn't like factually prove. To Nietzsche, is that, you know, does he give a confused look like, what are you wasting your time for? Or is it all about like, what purpose does this serve for you? Why do you care so much about it? Does this make you happy?
You know, I don't think he cares about your phenomenology. I
Right.
mean, happy in terms of a good life, eudaimonia, mia, as Aristotle called it. Yeah, you could pursue one of those questions and be wonderfully creative, and I think that would cut it for Nietzsche. And remember this, you quite rightly pointed out that Russell says he's contradictory, and he looks like he's contradictory about truth. He seems to, you know, I admire people who can face the truth. You've got to be strong enough to face the truth that life is irredeemably painful, etc. So he seems to be one of the guys who values truth, and other times he seems to be poo-pooing truth. Okay, so the way to think it again is this. He does think truth is a value. He thinks he's getting to certain truths. Like he wants to say, I've got to the truth that Christianity is really born out of a certain kind of rancor towards this world, the one and only world. He thinks that's the truth about the psychology of Christianity. The thing is, what he says is part of our modern mindset that we've inherited from Christianity is that Christianity is a value that overrides every other value. So not Christianity. What Christianity and the modern tradition teaches us is that truth is a value that overrides all other values. Everything is to be sacrificed to the truth. Whereas for Nietzsche, the truth is a value, an end in itself, but there are other competing values. Just to give you an example, one of the things he thinks is a problem of modernity is that he says we have a need for meaning, but often our will to truth kind of destroys all those stories, like for instance the Christian story or the Marxist story or whatever, that seem to enchant the world, to use a term, that seem to give the world meaning. So there you see a clash. We have a need, and he thinks it's a good need, to find the world meaningful, but we also have a will to truth, and often our will to truth destroys all those stories that give the world meaning. So should we just give into the will to truth and destroy all those stories? Now, this is the kind of questions Nietzsche's asking. So, yeah, it might look like he's against truth. No, he's not against truth, and he's not for truth simpliciter. He values truth, but there are other values, and the values need a healthy person balances the value. What he doesn't like is when you become a monomaniac. Says, no, we have to be nothing but monsters of treason, or we have to be nothing but monsters of reason, not treason, or everything has to be sacrificed to the truth. That kind of monomaniacy, he thinks is a pathology.
Nietzsche didn't like socialism. He didn't like capitalism either. So what did he like?
Okay, this is a real problem, and I know people who have left the field of Nietzsche studies, mainly in Germany, because they say, and what politics comes out of Nietzsche? And no politics comes out of Nietzsche. We know he likes aristocracies. He likes a pathos of distance, an ordering of rank, etc. But what is he suggesting? Is he suggesting we reinstitute an aristocracy and nobility? There's no positive suggestion. He's one of these 19th century thinkers who think, look, it's inevitable. Democracy is coming. That train has left the station. A period of democracy and egalitarianism, and he thinks mediocrity is coming to us. So by the end, he just wants to inspire a few individuals to kind of rise above it. The early Nietzsche, when he was follower of Wagner, had this idea that we could have a new mythology, what Wagner was trying to introduce with his ring cycle of operas, a new mythology, a mythology that kind of presents itself as mythology, not as truth, that could be the engine of a higher culture. But he realized that was young and naive, and he realized, no, democracy's coming, nothing to stop that train. And all I can do is talk to the other great individuals. So you don't get a positive politics out of Nietzsche, and it's very disappointing in a way. You know, you have no sense of what is a state he'd like to come to.
It sounds like he didn't like democracy. What would he have said about slavery, or did he say anything about slavery?
Good thing.
Good thing.
He said, yeah.
But not according to race, I assume. Would it be race, or would it be like IQ, or?
No, he just thinks, look, you need people doing the grunt work so the brilliant people can have time to pursue their ends. You know, like a lot of people, he venerated the ancient Greeks. And the ancient Greeks, you know, 9 out of 10 people in their societies were slaves, if you look at Sparta. And he actually thinks we have slavery today, by the way, because he thinks we have what we would, he didn't use this term, but he saw what capitalism was. He says, you know, there's a wage slaves. He saw that's where capitalism is heading. What he doesn't like about capitalism is it's, you know, the values of well, he wouldn't use this word, but crass consumerism and materialism, that people just want creature comforts. It's also, you know, attuned to the problem of suffering. I don't want suffering. I want to make my life as comfortable as possible. I just want pleasure. He thinks that is not a worthwhile aspiration for a person. What a person should actually almost in some sense not seek out suffering, but seek out challenges, and severe challenges. And if you're doing a severe challenge, you're going to have a lot of failure. And if you're going to have a lot of failure, you're going to have suffering. So this religion of comfortableness, he doesn't like. And he also associates capitalism with that, because capitalism is, you know, tells people to accumulate wealth so you can make your life more comfortable. He thinks that is a very low aspiration for a human. You know, the herd, the cows, just want to ruminate and feel comfortable and have a full belly. Humans should aim for something higher than that. And he thinks capitalism is also part of the religion of comfortableness. I mean, he knows there can be super, you know, the oligarchs, the people who are obsessed with getting extreme wealth, but to what end? Not to anything creative or worthwhile in his mind. And he says it creates that as a norm for other people, that what counts as accumulation of wealth so that one can, you know, purchase things and have comfort, etc. He thinks it's all low aspirations for humans.
It's often thought that suffering is bad in itself. Not so for Nietzsche.
Now, this is a vexed question. My friend and colleague Chris Janaway has written very nicely on this. Yeah, you know, Chris has tried to say that for Nietzsche, if suffering in itself isn't even intrinsically bad. And there's some argument for that, but I think the better thought is he's diagnosing that we are obsessed with the problem of suffering. I guess a more relaxed Nietzsche could say, yeah, look, there's nothing great in suffering in itself. And maybe there is something bad in suffering itself. You know, it's bad for you. But we have an obsession with wanting a life completely devoid of suffering. And that is what he's acutely aware of. And that is what the focus is for him. Because he says he wants us to be ambitious. He wants us to have a severe self-love. And that severe self-love means trying to make the most of ourselves, which means, as I said before, taking up challenges. And if you need to give yourself a serious challenge, which means you've got to embrace the possibilities of failure and suffering. And wanting to avoid suffering is not practicing that severe self-love, which will make the most of you. So yeah, maybe he didn't think such suffering was intrinsically bad, but I think the better thought of his would be to say, let's bracket whether suffering is intrinsically bad, or even let's admit in some sense it's intrinsically bad. But just because it's bad doesn't mean it has to be avoided completely. You know, he says the same about sickness. He says, you know, some people want to be absolutely free of sickness, but you get the great health by becoming sick, if you like, becoming infected, and then developing antibodies, if you like, and getting beyond it. So he doesn't have this view of health that is very common. To be utterly healthy would never have to be sick. Now, he has this thing he calls the great health. The great health involves being sick, but then overcoming it. Same with suffering. The great life involves having suffering, but overcoming it and making something out of yourself despite the suffering.
If he did believe that suffering is intrinsically bad, wouldn't that lead to him believing in objective morality? I mean, isn't objective morality based on basically a first premise that suffering is intrinsically bad?
Okay, so I think the way Nietzsche might, you know, I wanted to bracket the question of objective morality, despite what Brian says that Nietzsche is against objective morality, and there is text to support Brian's view. I think the better way to think of it is suffering bad for, see, he won't say is suffering bad. You remember I said he's a local thinker? He won't give these blanket answers the way, you know, a utilitarian would, or a Kantian might. He'd say, is suffering bad for this person? Is it bad for that person? He says, in my case, my suffering was some of the engine that drove me into some of my greatest thoughts and greatest ideas. My suffering at the hands of Wagner. You know, he ends up repudiating Wagner and saying, you know, Wagnerism was a sickness for me, but he never regrets being sick, because that sickness led him to something beyond and something greater. Whereas other people are just sick. It doesn't make them any better. They're just suffering and they don't make anything of it. Maybe they're too weak to, maybe they're too pathetic, maybe they just don't have the abilities. So I think the thing is to say, Nietzsche wouldn't say, is suffering good or bad? He's saying, what is the value of this suffering? What is the value of that suffering? I think, and sometimes he says, there's no value to that suffering. In this case, there is value to, there's value to his suffering with Wagnerism.
You said that he didn't regret being sick. I want to end on his great idea of Amor Fati and how it relates to eternal recurrence. He believed this was his biggest accomplishment. Is that right? Of ideas?
Yeah, he thinks this is his great gift to mankind, his book Zarathustra and the idea of the eternal recurrence. You know, most of us Nietzsche scholars are pretty embarrassed about both. We're pretty embarrassed about the eternal recurrence, and we're pretty embarrassed about Zarathustra, which is terribly bombastic. It's bad in English and it's worse in German. And it's not my first language, but it's my wife's first language. And she says, yeah, it's worse in German than in English.
Well, I'm sorry, real quick, worse in German in what way? About how bombastic it is?
It's bombastic in English, and it sounds even worse in German.
Got it.
Over the top bombastic.
Got it.
Look, I think the thing to be said is about both eternal recurrence, Amor Fati, and also Zarathustra, is Nietzsche thinks that after 2,000 years of what he calls self-vivisection because of Judeo-Christian ideas, we've so repudiated our own nature, our bodily inclinations, our propensities, drives towards appropriation and violence and overcoming, etc. We've learned to be passive and meek and turn the other cheek and love the neighbor, etc. He thinks we've been so invested in this kind of what he thinks of self-violation that we don't know what it would look like to have a worldview that affirms the world. So I think with the eternal recurrence, it's not like the test of what it is to be a life affirmer. It's an example of life affirmation. Because think about what Christianity says. Christianity says this world isn't the real world. The real world is the world to come. So these people are full of rancor and hatred, he thinks, and resentment towards this, the one and only world. So it's a kind of a joke against them. He says, no, you should think of this world as a world to be the eternal world, to be repeated endlessly. But his point is, first of all, it's a joke against the Christians who long for eternity somewhere else, saying eternity here, eternity now. But his real point is, for you, if you could embrace this world and want it all back over and over again, well, if you want everything back over again, including the spider who bit you or whatever, you know, that's when the idea seems foolish. Why do I need to have everything? His point is, if you could get to that point, that would be a point where you'd be free of resentment against this world. Because he seems to have an incredible resentment of resentment. And actually, I think that's a mistake on his part, because he should have realized, and I think in the end, he did in a certain way realize, resentment is actually one of the key stirrers to creativity. You remember, I mentioned that guy Bloom before, Anxiety of Influence. Bloom made the point that there are these strong poets who feel resentment at previous strong poets. It's very Oedipal. They want to kill the father. They resent them because they feel dominated by them, and then they find their own voice and they have their own creative milieu. Well, Nietzsche is very much like that. He has huge resentment against the Judeo-Christian worldview, but in the end, he comes up with his own kind of worldview in contraposition to that. And so I think a clever Nietzsche would have realized, and I think at some point he does realize, he often says, I experienced resentment and got beyond it. It's bullshit. He was a man of resentment up until the end, but he also, I think, you realize that resentment can be a huge engine for creativity, as it was in his case.
Didn't he have some embarrassing note where he
tried to prove it?
Yeah, he tried to prove that it actually existed, that we actually do come back over and over and over.
He had some notes where he tried to prove that, you know, there's only a finite number of possibilities when they're exhausted. It's all crap, but it's just a few throwaway lines in notes. I think it's my, you know, but except for Paul Loeb, of the modern Nietzsche scholars, we nearly all accept it's kind of trying to get you into a perspective to affirm. It's about life affirmation. It's not a serious metaphysical thought. But you're right, there are some notes where he seems to look for a metaphysical proof. Yeah.
So some random person comes up to a philosopher and says, why should I believe what you're saying? And a philosopher says, well, I've laid out an argument. You know, it's a valid argument. It's a sound argument. This is why you should believe that, you know, abortion is permissible or eating meat is wrong or whatever it is. Somebody comes up to Nietzsche and says, why should I accept your claims or your views? Does Nietzsche have a response for that?
It's a really difficult question. I'll give you an example. Nietzsche once met these two old ladies when he was in the Engadine Valley. Actually, behind me, you'll see a poster of St. Moritz, which is in the Engadine Valley. Nietzsche used to go there. And funnily enough, my wife's father was a goat herder as a boy in the very valley that Nietzsche used to hang out in. Bit of background. He met these two old ladies and they'd heard of him and they thought, you know, could you tell us which of your books you should read? And he could see that these were old, comfortable ladies, you know, they're basically from a Christian background. And he didn't want them to read anything because he didn't think they'd get any good out of it, right? So before Nietzsche would be saying why you should believe it, he'd be thinking, should you believe it? Are my ideas going to be healthy for you, or are they just going to lead nowhere? So yeah, a typical philosopher might want to convince everyone, but Nietzsche, when he's got his wits about him, of course, there's a careerist and the ambitious guy who would have liked to have more readers, etc. But putting aside those personal problems of his, what his philosophy tells us is, yeah, I don't need to convince everyone, right? I need to convince certain people because I think it will be good for them. And then there's a question of how he convinces them. And that's a complicated issue, but he's not a guy into convincing everyone.
Thanks, Ken.
Okay.